Here he comes. I usually go by that monitor's usually the cue. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this regular scheduled meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 12th, 2021. I'm going to open the meeting at 7:30. Can we still please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May I have roll call, please?
Mr. Sinaki,
Present.
Mr. Watson,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Here.
Mr. McHale,
Here.
Mr. Nushai,
Here.
Mr. Pernick, and Ms. Redmond.
Here.
Okay, so we have over a quorum that we need.
I think we forgot me.
Oh, sorry.
And Mr. Fitzer.
Here.
I grabbed an old sheet, I apologize.
Nice catch. I'll entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes from our last regular meeting. If someone would like to motion that.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the meeting from, and I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me right at the moment,
September 28th.
from September 28, 2021.
Second.
Motion and support. Any changes? Anybody see anything wrong with it? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Mr. Fitzer,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nushai,
Yes.
Mr. Pernick, Ms. Redmond,
Yes. Yes.
and Mr. Sinaki.
Yes.
Mr. Watson.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Agenda item number 5, public discussion, items that are not on the agenda. If anyone from the public would like to speak, now's your time.
Thank you, Planning Commission, for giving us an opportunity to give you input about the medical marijuana businesses.
Could you please start with your name and address?
Oh, sure.
The formality is.
Sure. I'm Susan Phillips, and I've been here since 1978. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I just had a quick question for you. This Planning Commission meeting notice was put in the Royal Oak Review on 9/22, and I just wondered, has anyone discovered what the I-2 district is? It was in this notice. Thank you.
The I-2 district is a district that is in the zoning ordinance. It is enumerated with, certain permitted uses and certain standards for setbacks and such. However, the I-2 district is not currently located on the zoning map of the city at the moment. It may never be placed on the zoning map. It is essentially a paper district that is sort of a placeholder within the ordinance. I don't know if there's ever been any I-2 zoning on the map in the past. It's possible that there was at some point, but there is not at present.
Joe, can you tell us if there are streets that would be part of I-2?
No, actually, because we don't have any planned I-2 under our master plan. So there's nothing on our future land use map that's planned to be I-2. And if I-2 were ever to come about in the city, it would probably be due to some sort of change in circumstances that required us to consider having a heavier industrial district. I don't foresee those circumstances arising anytime in the near future. You never know. But we don't have a plan to put it on the map at the moment, and it would either need to be initiated by someone who wanted to have an I-2 parcel and asked for rezoning, in which case they'd be kind of up against our master plan, or there would have to be some major change of circumstance.
So what you're saying, it's a heavy industrial area and we don't have any heavy industry at this time?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Okay. And the other question I had is, this was really helpful to have this public notice about this meeting. Would this commission consider putting up the zoning map in the paper so that a lot of the seniors who aren't able to get online might have an opportunity just to see what the plan is before the election? I mean, we're not telling them how to vote. We just want them to have some transparency, and I know that that's how Reese was running her campaign. And I just thought that that would be fair to the seniors. So thank you for considering.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd actually like to address the last comment.
Sure.
I understand the sentiment there. One thing is that the Planning Commission doesn't have any fiscal control, so it couldn't actually ask the city to publish anything because there's a cost of publishing. So the Planning Commission, if it were to so choose, could make a recommendation that something to that effect be done, but it would be an advisory opinion, I guess.
Right.
But I just wanted to clarify that the Planning Commission couldn't actually order something to be published or request that something be published directly.
Who would normally make that decision?
It would be the city council. Yeah.
Council? Okay, thank you.
How soon would our request potentially make it to council? If we were to make it, let's say now, today, that we made a request, is that something they have to bring in front and speak of?
Well, good evening. It wouldn't be necessarily in any formal vote or in any formal path this coming meeting because the agenda is already out. However, obviously, by the next meeting, we could put it included in the agenda. As far as informally, if you make such a motion today, or if you give such directive and request to the city council, obviously those of us between myself and Nick and Joe will make sure that it gets brought up and considered. But again, in some sort of unofficial capacity, to the extent that I'll address it at during my comments.
Thank you.
Sure.
Follow up on that one, if I could. Couldn't that request, if, as Ms. Redmond mentioned, be presented and sent to council, it could still be on their agenda in plenty of time?
Yeah, I mean,
Because,
they can amend their agenda at any given time,
Correct.
obviously. So I presume we're talking about our abilities. I can speak for council as to what they would do with respect to it, but I imagine that the answer to that could potentially be yes, of course.
right, because they have a certain amount of time before
And they have the
that's
authority.
finalized.
Yeah, they have the authority to make their own, to make their own determinations with respect to their own agenda.
Correct. So in essence, you
So
could,
unofficially,
you could
we'll
do
put
that.
it out there
And it could be official tonight with our respect as far as the request. And then it would be up to city council to add it to their current agenda.
you want me to make a formal motion, but I'll have to wait till the right time, correct? Or should I?
That would,
Yeah, okay,
This wouldn't be the
yeah.
moment.
Right, I didn't think so. Okay.
this would or would not?
Would not.
Not right now. We're
Yeah,
still
just for clarity.
We're still open for the public here.
Understood.
And thank you for considering it. I think there's only one more council meeting until the end of the month, is there not? So that it would be now or never, so thank you so much.
Thank you. And do we have anyone online from the public wishing to state anything? See nothing, no hand, well, there's a hand raised, whatever that means. Can you talk them through it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jerry Griffin. I'm curious. This is being a Zoom meeting. I have the meeting ID. Is there any way to watch this, or am I strictly limited to audio? Because I would need the passcode or an invitation to the link.
It's available on YouTube. If you go to City of Clawson YouTube, it should be on there
Oh, gee.
broadcasting live, I believe, at this time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do I hit *6 to mute myself again?
I believe so.
That was it. As seeing no other questions, I will then close public comment. And we'll move on to agenda item number 6, which is a public hearing on amendments to section 34-481, 34-922, 34-1200, 20.21, 34-1104, and 34-1074, governing medical marijuana primary caregivers. So, Joe, you want to give us a direction here as to a synopsis of what these are actually changing?
Sure. Right, so there are two topics related to cannabis on the agenda tonight. This first one is a public hearing, and the second one is a discussion item. So this first one deals solely with medical marijuana primary caregivers. This was a distinction that was established in 2008. It was an initiated law. Back in 2008, voters in Michigan voted to permit medical marijuana. And at the time, the legislature wrote the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, the MMMA, which allowed a primary caregiver registered with the state to grow enough plants for up to five patients and themselves, which is 72 plants because it's 12 plants per person under the license. And ever since, there have been primary caregivers across the state, growing their plants and distributing their product to their patients. And a lot of those operations occur in homes, most of them. A lot of communities actually adopted zoning ordinances that made it a home occupation. And that was in part because early on, there was a lot of uncertainty as to how much you could do with zoning for this use. That uncertainty was clarified somewhat in 2020 by the Michigan Supreme Court in its decision in DeRuyter versus Township of Byron, where they found that the MMMA doesn't nullify a municipality's authority to regulate land use under the Zoning Enabling Act as long as the community doesn't prohibit marijuana cultivation by a registered primary caregiver, and as long as the community doesn't impose restrictions that are inconsistent with the regulations established by state law. So the case applies really to primary caregivers. That was the use that was at question in the case. So when we look at why we're talking about this tonight, we've discussed it several times, but this being a public hearing, I'll go through the history here. As the city has discussed regulating marijuana uses prompted by the two ballot initiatives, there was this primary caregiver issue kind of lingered in the background because it's a separate issue. Those ordinances or ballot initiatives don't concern primary caregivers at all. So there have been a lot of inquiries made in the last couple of years about establishing registered primary caregiver operations in the city, and that included multiple inquiries pertaining to commercial or industrial buildings, indicating intent to group multiple caregivers in a single facility. The use can't be prohibited, and we don't have anything in our zoning ordinance to regulate them at the moment. So really, if someone comes to us wanting to put multiple caregivers in a single building right now, we don't really have anything to say about that because we don't govern the use in our zoning ordinance at all. If multiple caregivers want to co-locate in a building together, so long as they're meeting the state standard for an enclosed lock facility, they can do that. And generally, most of our caregiver operations, though, that we're aware of, are in residential neighborhoods, they're in homes. There can be some negative externalities to having these operations in neighborhoods. It's obviously, there's not always negative externalities, but there can be. That it can include brownouts via excessive electricity use for grow lamps. That can include odor. That can include property neglect on properties that are held solely for the purpose of conducting a caregiver operation and not lived in. And given that we don't have any zoning regulations about it, we don't require that a person who's conducting that operation lives in the house. So someone could potentially buy a house just to do the operation. They could have multiple operations in there if they could meet the enclosed lock facility standard.
Can we modify it to that degree, that they must live in the house?
There's some debate about that, which is part of the reason that what we're doing with this amendment is moving it out of residential neighborhoods.
Right.
And we're moving it to a couple of other districts with a generally industrial character. And I'll go through some of the peculiarities of how we're doing that as I get to the ordinance, but I'll finish up the background, I guess, before I do that. But it was a good
Question
question.
first.
Sure, yeah.
But if we move it strictly to a commercial area, isn't that going to almost incentivize people to have multiple people growing in one building?
It's addressed in the language of the ordinance. So we've actually got a cap on the number that can be co-located in the same facility to kind of try to deal with that. Let's see. I guess before I get to the ordinance itself and what it says, we'll talk about some of the impacts and considerations that we consider during the drafting of this. So right now, most of our caregiver operations are located in homes. We have those potential health and safety issues. It's not just the externalities that I just mentioned. There's a high water use for the grow operations, and that can lead to mold problems. That's a pretty well documented issue, which of course affects the actual unit of housing stock itself. If you start to have problems with something like that, that can actually compromise the structure itself over time. And then with the non-occupancy issue, also there's the chance that you can start to lose some neighborhood cohesion too. If you have too many of these operations in one concentrated area, you get kind of a pockmarked effect where some of the houses are lived in and some of the houses are not. It would take a lot of those uses probably to have a very profound effect on a neighborhood, but nevertheless, it's something that's possible. When we look at caregivers in non-residential districts, so locating them entirely in non-residential districts can relieve some of the issues that the use can cause in a neighborhood. It does lead to some other considerations. Commercial and industrial property does tend to be more expensive. So you have to be careful that you're not creating an insurmountable hurdle to the people who want to do this use, because you cannot prohibit the use under state law. So single caregivers, often can't obtain and maintain a property on their own. That leads a lot of them to try to group together to establish multiple operations in one place. You could potentially have a property owner that establishes a condominium where spaces are rented out to caregivers. Or you could have, somebody who owns an auto repair garage who has kind of a spare room up in the back, who leases that spare room to a single caregiver. You could totally do that right now. I mean, we don't have anything in our zoning ordinance that says you can't. So there may be operations that are doing that right now. I don't happen to know of any, but it's possible. And then there's another consideration too, which is on-site distribution. So in the absence of local regulation, caregivers can distribute their product to their registered patients on-site. So if you're doing it out of your house, you can have your patients come to your house and you can sell them the product there. So I guess that brings us to the ordinance, which has a couple different parts. The first part is establishing definitions. So we have a definition for cannabis facilities. We have a definition for cannabis, also known as marijuana with an H or marijuana with a J. Marijuana with an H is the annoying spelling that the state uses. Marijuana with a J is the correct spelling, and then cannabis is the prevailing industry term. That's the term we're going with here. Caregiver facility is defined. Medical use, cannabis is defined. Primary caregiver is defined, and qualifying patient is defined. These definitions reflect the state statute. We didn't really change anything. These are terms that are really taken from state law. The second part of the law, of the ordinance, is the meat of it. So it says where they would be permitted, and we've got the I-1 district and the BRD2 district as the permitted districts. And I can discuss some of the rationale behind that. We have an intent statement. It's a fairly lengthy intent statement that talks about what exactly it is we're trying to do here and why. So we refer to the legal opinion of the state Supreme Court in the intent statement. We don't refer to the case by name, but we do refer to the fact that it's been found that the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act does not nullify a municipality's inherent authority to regulate land use under the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. The next section of the ordinance basically is our caveat. It's that the ordinance has no effect on patient use. So if you are the patient of a primary caregiver who is growing cannabis in Clawson and you receive your product from your primary caregiver, you can consume it in accordance with state law. And our ordinance has nothing to say about that. I'll also note, I guess on that note, that any person in the entire state of Michigan who wants to can grow 12 plants for themselves for any reason. So this doesn't affect that either. You know, that's outside the scope of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, and it's outside the scope of this ordinance. The next section is kind of another caveat. It basically says your operation under this ordinance is not a defense against criminal prosecution. This is still illegal at the federal level. And if there were to be some enforcement from a federal law enforcement agency, excuse me, throat's drying out, or from another agency acting on behalf of the federal government, you would not be protected by this ordinance from prosecution. And then finally, on number 4, we get to the standards that apply to primary caregiver facilities. So we have an applicability statement, and then we have a statement about compliance with state laws and rules, because in order to be a registered primary caregiver, they have to comply with a specific set of state laws. And then Laura issues administrative rules to govern the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, so they need to comply with the rules as well. We are establishing a minimum floor area of 750 square feet of floor area per primary caregiver. And that's a figure that's based on the amount of area that it takes to actually grow these plants, and it's a studied figure. And there's a floor plan requirement there, so if you've got more than one primary caregiver facility located in a single building, we need to see a floor plan that's approved by the city, and each individual locked facility has to have a separate certificate of zoning compliance and a separate certificate of occupancy in order to be occupied and operate. Secure facilities is the next item, and what that does is it relates to state law. You have to be in compliance with the secure facility provisions of state law. And then it also refers to state law in its discussion of vehicles being used to temporarily transport cannabis from one location to another. And then we have some appearance standards. If you were to actually build something to do this use, it would be designed and maintained in a manner consistent with other permitted uses in the zoning district. Grow lights, plants, growing and processing areas aren't supposed to be visible from a property line. If you've got exterior windows, they're supposed to be frosted or screened or otherwise modified to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission, so that the use won't be visible from any property line. Bars and other security features that are highly visible are not permitted unless the Planning Commission makes a finding that the design of the security features is in keeping with the spirit and intent of the ordinance. And then outdoor storage is prohibited. The next item governs odor. So all primary caregiver facilities are going to have to include odor control methods that follow industry best practices for removal of odor. And you're not allowed to use an ozone generator as an odor neutralization method. That actually is its own pollution problem. So we don't want people to try to neutralize an odor with something that causes a separate problem. Distribution on site is prohibited under these regulations. Use or consumption on site is prohibited by the qualified patient on the premises of the primary caregiver facility, so they're not going there and then using it there. Alcohol is prohibited to be sold to convey or conveyed on the site of a primary caregiver. There's no identifying signage permitted, so no green crosses or pot leaves or any of the other kind of iconography that's common. And you're also not allowed to have a vehicle parked anywhere on the premises that has signage such as that. All your permits are required, so you got to get your building, mechanical, plumbing, electrical permits for any portion of the structure where you're doing any of that to support the cultivation. It's all subject to inspection. And then we have a kind of a broad nuisances clause. So no caregiver facility can be operated in a manner that creates noise, dust, et cetera, that would create a nuisance for surrounding properties. When we look at non-conforming registered primary caregivers, we have caregivers in homes right now. This would not permit a new caregiver operation to be established in a home. But as with any other use, if you've legally established a use and then it is prohibited in the zoning district in which you are operating or on the property in which you are operating because the zoning changed or something like that, you are allowed to continue the use as a non-conforming use until the use ceases.
Until what?
Until the use ceases. Usually in our zoning ordinance, we have a 6-month standard for the cessation of the use. And that's pretty common in zoning ordinances. So usually when you're looking at a non-conforming use, if the use ceases for 6 months, then it ceases to be a non-conforming use and is now simply a non-compliant use if someone restarts it. And there are a few.
Joe, sorry to interrupt. How do you know it's ceased
Well,
to exist?
That is actually difficult to determine sometimes.
Yeah, I wouldn't, especially if we're not doing any type of yearly, applying for a license.
Which we don't know that we can do under state law, and that's why it's not in here.
Okay.
Yeah, with any use, it can be difficult to establish that the use has ceased for 6 months. And one way that uses can be preserved, even if they do cease to operate, is if you are earnestly marketing the property for that use. In the case of a medical marijuana primary caregiver, that's kind of, I don't know, maybe somebody would market a house that way, but.
We don't
Say,
allow
market a
it,
house, Joe,
though.
you talked about sell the house and does that person that buys the house, can they just continue with that?
Yeah, I mean, it runs with the land. It's a non-conforming use. So yes, technically speaking, so yeah, somebody could do that, yeah.
Okay.
But, it's like any other non-conforming use, and we have to treat this like any other non-conforming use. We can't treat it differently because we're prohibited from doing that. So if you're a registered primary caregiver and your operation was lawfully established prior to the adoption of this, you can continue to do that on your property. And then we have some zoning review application requirements. This is what you have to turn in order to be approved to do this. And there's a parking requirement, and that's 1 space per 375 square feet of gross leasable area. Honestly, that's probably a somewhat excessive parking requirement because we're requiring each one of these to be 750 square feet, and only one person can ever be in there at once. So you're going to get 2 parking spaces out of that. It's probably good to have 2 instead of just 1, just in case we've got to have an inspector there or something like that. But that's the parking requirement that we've got in our draft. So if there are any questions about any of the specifics or anything like that, I'll answer them, and then we'll go to the public.
So it says distribution on site prohibited. So they can't sell it on the site,
Right.
but they can take it off the site, and where can they sell it? Can they take it to someone's home? Like, how do they distribute?
Yeah, most likely they would probably take it to the home of the person they're selling it to.
Okay.
So, a few questions. Do we have any idea of how many we have in Clausen operating out of homes at this time?
We do not have a way of getting a specific number, no.
Do we have an roundabout number? More than 40? More than 50? Like, do we have anything?
We would be guessing.
Okay, because they've only registered with the state, and the
Exactly.
state does not privy us to that information?
That's
as a
correct.
city?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so I know that you said a few things I want to address. There's a few things I want to address. One, in terms of residents in support of cannabis, I think they're in support of it mostly because they're in support of a small business type facility. And my inclination is that if we go to zoning in a commercial capacity, that we're going to eliminate, 80% of our people in their ability to earn an income, which they've been doing, or whatever it is, over time, right? Let me go back to, I saw that there was some legislation this week, and I'm sure that you saw that as well, Joe. The Michigan State, they voted on 3 bills that would, essentially, it would only allow caregivers to sell to 1 patient if it moves forward. It's, from what I read, bipartisan. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, it was introduced back on September 14th, and I'm not sure it's in committee yet, but it is, it's been introduced, and yes, it would limit the sale by a primary caregiver to 1 patient, and they could still grow for themselves because anybody can grow for themselves, regardless of whether or not you're a primary caregiver. And there are other things that it would do, but that's kind of the big one.
It also cost them money in terms of them needing to test their
yes,
product as well.
They would need to test their product, which they don't have to do now.
So that would be an impossibility if that were to pass, and essentially we'd be zoning them out. because it's impossible for them to, you said, if they were to buy a commercial building as one entity, they couldn't afford it. If 5 one entities bought in, selling to one patient, that's not going to be possible.
Right.
So
So if that ever passed, yeah, we would probably have to reassess what we're doing. Yeah.
yeah, well, it sounds like it's bipartisan as far as I knew, and I don't know a lot about it.
Well, I mean, I guess the main thing I'll say is it requires a 75% threshold in the legislature, which is a pretty high bar.
Okay.
Because it's modifying an initiated law. So it's not like going to pass next week or something.
It's not a huge concern.
If such a law were to pass, obviously we would have to assess the effect on local growers. I mean, clearly we would, but that's if it passes. And right now, it's a long way from passing, and it may never pass. So we have to act on the basis of current law and, what's happening in the state now. And we can reassess if something passes in the future.
Sure. Okay. So I know that you addressed certain things like brownouts, water usage, and that's something that is a concern for all residents in Clawson. But I don't see how moving them down the street is going to necessarily offset that. We still share an electric and a sewer system. So I'm not sure if that's something that will be offset. Is there, what would stop us, and I didn't look too far into how we zone our residential, I can't think of the right word right now, but like the home occupancy, what would stop us from being able to go in there and do our inspections and regulate as a business from home?
Well, we inspect when changes are made. So if you are not making changes to your electrical service, if you are not making changes to your mechanicals or plumbing or other things, then generally we're not doing an inspection. And we don't know where the residential caregivers are. So we don't have any way of figuring out who we would be inspecting, I guess. And you're correct that our industrial and commercial districts use the same sewer system and the same electrical grid as our residential uses. The primary difference is that a standard electrical service for a house is typically considerably lower voltage than a typical electrical service for an industrial building. Mm-hmm. And so the electrical companies, when they put their transformers in place, are anticipating certain loads from certain uses. And that's part of the reason that you get the brownout problem, is that they're not anticipating someone drawing, an excessive amperage on a 200 amp service.
Well, yeah, but I bet if we called DTE, they'd tell us who our caregivers were, because they can tell, right?
They may be able to tell, yeah. And we can look at our water bills and things and guess, but it's always a guess. We're never 100% sure. And, with the water service, I think there's a similar, issue there. You have certain size services to industrial properties, whereas residential services tend to be different. And then you have certain main sizes that serve non-residential properties versus residential properties. So in terms of, the anticipated water usage, I think there's some differences there as well.
Do you think that BRD2 at those little offices have a considerably bigger size?
Most of BR2 is not little offices. Most of BRD2 is large industrial.
BRD2, all right, I'll have to look at it. Maybe I'm thinking of BRD1.
BRD1 is on South Main.
Okay.
Yeah, BRD2 is on Crooks Road.
Oh, okay, I was thinking Rochester. So, yes, I was thinking the wrong one. Okay, so what stops us from amending our out-of-home occupation to bring in a caregiver and essentially be able to regulate and be able to check in yearly, do inspections and things like that versus moving these guys over?
I might look to my left for a little bit of help with the inspection question.
And if I may, that's not the issue on the table, is it?
Huh?
Right? That's not the issue on
Yeah,
the
it
table.
is.
Well, I'm not so sure.
It's approving for this, so.
Right, but I think specifically, on the specific, everything up until now, I think you're right on point, perfectly legitimate question.
Rainus, could you talk to the microphone? I'm sorry, I'm not
My
hearing you
apologies,
completely.
yeah. No, I'm speaking specifically with respect to what is to stop us from doing X. Right? That's not what we have here. You know, nothing's to stop you, I think, is the answer. You can do
Oh,
whatever you please.
good.
But I think we're probably steering a little too far. That's just my 2 cents.
Okay,
Not to
thanks.
dissuade
No,
you
you're
from
not
your
dissuading me at all,
question.
don't worry.
I know.
And really, we're here to discuss it, and when it's proposed in a way of, these are the issues that we face as a city, and here's our solution, if there's other solutions, I want to talk about them, especially if, like I said, we're going to go from a home occupation that people have been counting on and depending on, and essentially taking 80, that's just pulling it out of nowhere. I have no idea what the number is, pulling that 80% and eliminating that ability.
So I guess aside from the fact that we don't know where most of our residential caregivers are, the issue with establishing an inspection regime for certain home occupations and not other home occupations is a disparate treatment issue. So if we're not going to inspect all of our home occupations, then inspecting this as a home occupation, if we're going to govern it as a home occupation, I think there's some difficulty there, because we're calling it a home occupation, but then we're treating it differently from the other things that we call home occupations. As far as, you know, inspecting these users or these uses as they currently stand in homes, again, I guess the primary hurdle to that is we simply don't know where most of them are, and we don't have a definitive way of getting a list of all of them. So if we guess right on one, then we're treating that use in one way, we're enforcing an ordinance on them, and if we've missed another one, we're not enforcing it on them. So that
So if we
becomes its
found
own
out someone was
issue.
operating like a daycare out of their house and they didn't register with us, how would we go about that?
Well, it would be a zoning violation if you're, it depends, I guess, on the scale, right? If they're looking after 2 kids, we might not even notice it, but if they're actually, if they've established a daycare where they've got multiple people dropping and off and picking up every day, and they've got multiple kids at all times, it's probably outside the scope of a home occupation, and they most likely are going to have to cease operations and move that business somewhere else.
So we've kind of allowed things to operate as they will right now because there's not a big strain on the community in terms of those home occupations.
Wait, I'm sorry, say that last part again, I didn't hear you.
And I'm not saying that's exactly what you're saying. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like we've kind of allowed home occupations to, we've kind of been laissez-faire, I guess, about them, allowing them to operate since they are not putting a strain on the community in terms of electrical and water.
But you're making that statement based on what Joe just said?
Possibly.
Because that's not a statement
But
I would
that's not
make.
really, that's just kind of Joe's opinion almost.
But also, I don't think we are being laissez-faire about home occupations,
I don't really know how
because
you're making that statement
part
based on
of
what Joe said.
the issue is we have to know about a violation in order to enforce on it. And if we don't know about a violation, we're not going to enforce on it. Like most communities in the post-2008 world where funding is scarce, we have primarily complaint-based enforcement. And that means that if we have a complaint about something or if something is very obvious, then we enforce on it. But if we're not aware of a situation, we don't enforce on it because we're not aware of it. And we don't actively go house to house looking for violations, essentially.
Right.
So, yeah, I would not say that we have a laissez-faire
Sorry,
disposition
okay,
toward.
I was lacking words, so I didn't mean to put that in your mouth. I apologize. The only other question I had about the different regulations is that the sheet that you guys sent us with the differences, the key differences, there's things that are not addressed in the medical marijuana. Such as, I mean, I know Class A, Class B, that doesn't apply, but in terms of, where is it at? The felony or controlled substance, it doesn't seem like the state of Michigan actually looks into that or regulates that in a capacity that I could find. And as well as the elected officials and government employees. How would we go about the potential of, implementing that, either, moving forward?
So you're asking if someone wanted to establish a primary caregiver operation in the city and had a felony record, how would we determine whether or not they could?
Well, I know that's something that comes with, like, when they apply, from what I can make of it, for other cannabis sales.
Right, but
And it's on this MML thing that you sent. Felony or controlled substance, felony within the past 10 years, misdemeanor conviction. So it seems like there's a pre-screening for that on other licenses, but it doesn't seem like the state actually screens for that.
I mean, I guess this short answer is that if the state has issued them a primary caregiver license, we have nothing to say about it. If it turns out they've got a felony record, the state issued them the license, and we have to treat them as a license holder.
So we don't determine the certain aspects of businesses that operate here?
Not in terms of primary caregivers. That's the state is the license issuing body, and we can't overrule the state on issuing a
Well,
license.
I'm talking about, okay, so I guess I'd have to preface that by saying, in terms of potentially putting forth some municipal licensing that they would have to go through. Yeah, we can't revoke a state license, but from what I was reading, there's many cities and municipalities that put forth their own licensing within the city.
There are municipalities in the state of Michigan that have established licensing regimes for primary caregivers. We do not have any legal precedent in the state that tells us that we can do that. It's the considered opinion of our attorney and many other municipal attorneys across the state that we don't have the power to do that. Because the state is the licensing body and we don't have any way of overruling them. So, I mean, let's say, by way of example, the state doesn't ask about your criminal history when they're determining whether or not you get issued a license to be a primary caregiver. And then we put a local licensing regime in place where we do ask if you have a criminal history. It doesn't matter what they tell us about their criminal history. If they've been issued a license by the state, we have to treat them as issued by license, as licensed by the state, and we have to let them operate in the city because they're licensed by the state. So getting that information for ourselves doesn't really have any effect on what we can actually do in terms of permitting the use or not permitting the use. And having a local licensing regime, I understand the appeal of it because it daylights everybody. It tells you where everybody is, and it gives you a way of communicating with them on a regular basis and establishing an annual inspection regime. But again, it's the opinion of a lot of municipal attorneys across the state, including our own, that we're not empowered to have a secondary licensing regime at the local level. There are communities that are trying it, and one of them is going to be a test case at some point. And we'll find out for real whether or not we can do it in the opinion of the Michigan Supreme Court. Until the Michigan Supreme Court weighs in on that, we are, correct me if you disagree with this, but we are best off not being the test case. So that's, I mean, maybe that's a long explanation, but that's why we're not looking at establishing a local licensing regime at the moment.
Okay. Or in terms of deciding, if we have multiples coming to us, and I don't think it was in here either, a buffer between like businesses or a buffer between adult use businesses. If we are, deciding which, stack of primary caregivers we're going to choose if we get multiple. I didn't see anything in the ordinance that kind of lays it out how we might determine competing candidates.
We do not choose between primary caregivers. If a person has a primary caregiver license from the state, we have to permit them to operate in the city of Clawson.
So we have to just keep zoning and zoning and zoning them into our ordinance?
We would, if we were to fill up a zoning district or something, we'd have to find another place for people to operate or another way to permit them, because we can't tell them that they can't operate here when they've got a state license. So, right now, they could literally be on all four sides of your house. So, buffering standards, we've got them put in two districts that are not within 1,000 feet of a school. So we know we're meeting the
But you're going from 72 plants to potentially 72 times 5, is it right?
3.
3?
Yep.
It's 3. So that's a lot more of an impact in terms of emissions and usage.
It is, but they could do 3 in a house right now if they split it up right.
They can do 3 in a house.
Sure. Yeah, if you can create 3 enclosed lock facilities in a house, there's no reason you can't.
And there's no regulation on square foot of a house?
No.
Yeah. I agree that there's zoning and things that need to happen. But interesting. Thank you.
Just to piggyback on that, Joe, I know you mentioned schools, and then also included in here were places of worship, parks, and substance abuse treatment centers.
That's the other ordinance, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get to that. Because that's the
Sorry,
other
I didn't want
ordinance,
to jump
yeah.
ahead of you.
Yeah, the only thing we're concerned with in this ordinance is the drug-free school
Okay,
area.
got
And
it.
because of the 2 districts that we put it in, we know that we're meeting the 1,000-foot buffer for the federal drug-free school area.
Is it safe to assume that our city attorney has read all this and is in agreement that we're within our rights making these ordinances?
Yes, I did. I reviewed, we've talked about, obviously, and this body has talked about this, obviously in the past as well, but we've met with Joe and Jill and Joan on numerous occasions, talked about it on numerous occasions, so we're comfortable. This is, a good product, so to speak. I think this is a great starting point. Obviously, there's an infinite amount of stuff that you can do. There's a lot of stuff that we cannot do, even though wishes we may. But this is a great starting point.
The city itself is not held liable for any of this because if anybody takes a fall, the state of Michigan's going to take a fall on it. However, in the unlikelihood that the federal government would come in and want to close someone down, which I think is very unlikely,
Nothing to do with us.
it's okay for a city to pass ordinances which are against federal regulations. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so I wouldn't frame it the way that you framed it. That's a curious way of doing it.
How
So I
would
disagree
a
with the
lawyer
basic-
say that then?
I would agree with the basic premise. So we're obviously, if you think about a city, we are we're a statutory creation of the state, right? It is our basic outline. So any and all authority that we have, the outer limits of it, are contained by statutes of the state. So operating under that regime, we can take the actions that we take, right? So there's a good reason why we're here. It's the Planning Enabling Act, Zoning Enabling Act, things of that nature. That's what we're operating under. So the short answer to your question is, can we do the things that we're purporting of doing? Yes. And as a matter of fact, the reason we're doing them because the Michigan Supreme Court has stated that we can. Up until the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in DeRuyter, nobody thought that we had that, the ability to do so.
Right.
So the federal issue obviously is looming always, but it has nothing to do with us. It will not impact this, this body or this city.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, I have a couple follow-ups. Real quick, number 4, standards. I guess I'm reading it wrong. The applicability, when it says primary care facility shall not operate on a zoning lot located, totally read it wrong, and I just need to read it out loud. Within the office district. Okay, I read it the other way, thinking that it was allowed in the office, and I was confused by that. And then secondly, I know that we've run into issues in the past where we have landlords that are not upkeeping buildings, and we feel frustrated because we feel like our hands are tied. And I felt as though, if we're going to get in the forefront of this, that there might be more in our ordinance that talks about, holding them accountable, or what we might do if there are multiple complaints, or there's also the security aspect of things that was not addressed in the ordinance. Are these things something that we're not allowed to impose as a city?
So security is addressed in state law. So they have to meet the state definition of an enclosed locked facility, and that's the limit of what we're able to require, is that they meet the state law. So we can't require them to put additional security measures in place. So that's that portion of it. In terms of potential externalities, section 4F and 4M are really the primary places where we deal with that, where we're kind of giving ourselves broad authority to enforce on nuisances and odor complaints. Odor is probably the primary complaint that it's been experienced across the state, so we put that in its own special section. So we are giving ourselves some, I don't know, I'll call them teeth, I guess, for enforceability. And then, of course, we have our other, blight ordinances that we rely on a regular basis for any property in the city. But that's those two provisions and the blight provisions that we have elsewhere in our code of ordinances. They're not in the zoning ordinance.
So how are these?
Or what we lean on for that.
How are these enforceable in any way? Or am I misunderstanding? Okay, we have 15 residents that come and complain about the same smell from the same building.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. I'm not sure. Where's the enforcement aspect of these?
Well, it's really embodied elsewhere in our zoning ordinance. We have enforcement provisions in the zoning ordinance, and we're outlining and we're enumerating the triggers for enforcement here. So if someone were to complain about any of these problems that are mentioned under M or F, that would trigger the enforcement mechanisms in our zoning ordinance, and our attorney, of course, deals with that far more than I do. Because it's really kind of the separation of our roles. But, we would find ourselves in an enforcement situation, which typically, the first person to go out is a code enforcement officer. And there's a process for issuing tickets and all that, and providing, opportunities for remedy. There's a due process. And if the problem is not corrected, then ultimately the escalation typically takes you into the court system. And That's how it could happen with really any violation of the zoning ordinance or any other ordinance for that matter. But really what we can do here is we can outline the triggers for enforcement, and then we rely on our pre-existing enforcement clauses in our zoning ordinance to give our code enforcement and attorney the ability to go and enforce on it.
So in terms of security, there's nothing that allows us to, let's say, ask them to have security cameras or certain types of lighting, or make the police aware of any type of activity that's happened. And that can't be something that the city is asking on its own.
No. Like I said, the security requirements are outlined in state law, and if they meet those requirements, then they're compliant as a primary caregiver, and so we can't pile on top of that.
So is this the way, I know we're only talking about caregiver, is this the way the other one works as well? So the state, because the state is saying, we've put that in our ordinance, we are not able to set any type of standard as a city for any of this?
Essentially, yeah, that's kind of where we are based on the way that the Reuter decision was written and the way the state law is written. We're not able to, we can't say, well, you have to put up a fence. We can't say you have to have bars on your window. We can't say you have to, not that we necessarily would, but I'm just giving examples here. We can't say that you have to have security cameras because if you're operating in accordance with state law as a primary caregiver, we have to permit you to operate. So we could request that you put a camera in, but we can't require it.
That can't be a part. So this sounds different than any other business that operates in Clawson, because we could really implement a lot of different things with a lot of different businesses. And and I don't know liquor or other adult use type facilities, but we just talked about it, an adult use facility. These guys have, I say these guys, but just this legislation has more leeway and disempowers municipalities more so than other businesses, it would seem, because that's something that's part of what zoning is.
Yeah, if the Michigan legislature's become fond of anything in the last 10 years, it's preempting municipalities. They've done a lot of it. They've done it on cell towers and all kinds of other things, 5G, you name it. They've been chipping at local authority a lot. And in this case, they didn't really chip away at local authority. It's when they established their own authority to license caregivers, they set forth a structure under which municipalities have to permit caregivers to operate, can't exclude them. And the basic summary of that structure is, if you are a registered primary caregiver with the state of Michigan and you are operating in accordance with the statute and the rules set forth by LARA for primary caregivers, we cannot prohibit you from operating. So if we were to require that they have bars on the window, which is not required by the state, and we were to tell them that they can't operate as a primary caregiver because they don't have bars on the window, that's not going to hold up to legal scrutiny because they're operating in accordance with the state statute and the rules propagated by LARA. They're doing everything that they have to do in order to be a legal registered primary caregiver. And we can't say, well, we don't think you're a legal registered primary caregiver because you're not doing this extra thing we asked you to.
Well, I'm not saying we're revoking licensing here, but I'm saying there's a difference between a revoking of a license and, let's say, enforcing a code.
Well,
And,
but if you're not going to revoke the license if they're not following the code, then what's the point of the code? Like,
well-
why have a rule if you can't enforce the rule?
well, that's how this whole thing is. We can't enforce, I mean, like,
Well,
look
no,
at what
but we
would we do?
can,
Well,
because we
what
can
would
tell
we
them
do with
where to
odor?
go.
Odor? I mean, we can enforce it to what, sending our guy out there? But,
Well, I mean,
and going to
if they don't
court?
remedy the problem, we can take them to court.
but we're not
you
going to
know.
revoke a license there.
Well, we can't revoke the license.
Right,
The
so
state's
I'm saying,
folks'
how is that
license to
different than
revoke, but
taking them
yeah.
to court for our standard of odor? And I'm sorry to like act like I'm challenging you, but I'm curious at how we're so pigeonholed on so many things as a city. And, you know, I go to Bloomfield Hills and you can't even have a sign that's red. It's so bizarre.
I work for the city of Bloomfield Hills.
Yeah.
I'm one of their planners, and their
What's their secret?
their secret is. I'm not going to say anything in public.
Let me
Okay,
speak
go
to regulation briefly, just so that, because I think that's a fair question, and that there's an answer, and it's, you know, maybe it's just, if I give you a brief overview, they'll address the question that you have. Obviously, Joe is exactly correct. We have the ability to prosecute pursuant to our code of ordinances with respect to any of these nuisances, and we have an entire body of law that deals with nuisances. And we prosecute on a daily basis, not with respect to marijuana, with respect to all other issues that deal in nuisances. You're not aware of it, probably, but I assure you it happens, and it's seamless in the city. And I imagine the reason that you don't object to living in this city is because there is appropriate enforcement, by code enforcement, which technically right now is under the chief of police jurisdiction. So we have that move additionally made possible, probably even more appropriate enforcement of these kinds of issues. This will fall, just as Joe indicated, it'll fall precisely under that guise. So that's going to continue forward. And, you know, in that respect, I think we should have no concerns as far as the nuisances are. Our prosecution is, you know, of misdemeanor level offenses, right? So, yeah, we have no authority to revoke somebody's license. I imagine, though, if, you know, Lara has its own procedures in place dealing with licenses. If somebody makes a complaint, or if there's sufficient, I suppose, complaints over time, I don't know, whatever their process is, you can engage in that process, or anybody can engage in that process to affect their licensing. We do what we can, and you're right, we regulated the margins. That's how the referendum that was initially passed limited us. That's how all these laws limit us. To the extent that it appears as if we're not doing enough, I assure you that's only because that's the limit of what we can do, unfortunately. If we could do more, we would do more. We want to do more, but this is the limitations that the state has placed upon us.
Until it's challenged, because there's many communities that put a lot more parameters on both.
What communities
I
are
guess-
those?
I sent you the information as well and asked Joe to make it a part of
So
it.
the ones
but,
with the Warren and East Detroit, and those,
there's Lansing, East Lansing, Warren, there's Detroit, and this is going off the top of my head. I want to say Waterford, Allen Park could have been one of them. I've looked over a lot of different, because I wanted to know what I didn't know.
My 2 cents, though, with respect to that issue, because you addressed it earlier and Joe responded, I think you responded appropriately, and I agree with the statement. My 2 cents is that a community such as this one, 2.2 square miles, with limited number of households, and as such limited amount of taxpayer dollars at work, should not be a test case community with respect to issues that are on the fringe. Because those communities that are regulating, they're not regulating based on any authority. They're regulating based on the assumption that we're going to do it until somebody challenges us to the contrary. We can have that. It's certainly doable. We as a community can decide. Clausen, you know, this body and the, you know, city council can tell us, you know, the rest of staff, say, we want to do that. That's perfectly appropriate. I just don't, in our considered opinion as a group, so to speak, we thought that that's unwise probably for this community. I think it's probably better for somebody else to be the test case and we learn from either their successes or failures, as opposed to for us to defend success or failure.
Continuation on this. In reference to this is basically a base amendment or the ordinances just to establish a base, correct? Would that be a safe statement on that?
I could agree with that. I can write.
Okay, and then by the same token, with reference to you with the lights and cameras and everything, residents don't need those. If there's a resident's house, we're talking residences here. If the light's too bright, there's an ordinance against that. We have that, and that can be enforced. We don't make people get security cameras. If I'm a businessman or a grower, yeah, you betcha I want some security cameras around my area of business and certain lighting, but it's going to be within the stated ordinances. That'd be like saying, okay, yeah, there's a $500,000 home in Clawson. Well, I'm sorry, you can't buy that unless you put a security camera in. You know, that's basically what you're saying on that too. We don't want to limit what we don't need to limit. That's kind of overkill on that. And reference these other cities, what specifically do those cities have that hasn't been brought up?
Oh, well, I don't want to go,
East
you want me to
Detroit?
go there? Because we'll be here all night.
Not a whole list, I'm just saying, do they require security cameras?
Oh, yeah, they'll require security cameras.
Is
and-
that for residences or?
No, we're
That's for
talking about
recreational.
moving, huh?
That's for the
No,
recreational
no, I
stuff.
found it in Caregiver. There's a lot of cities that write a municipal code for,
What purpose do the cameras serve for?
I believe it's probably for resident and community feeling better about things being secure. That's the same reason why you might put a Ring doorbell on your door, is that you just,
The community to feel
well,
better?
just I'm not
Cameras
speaking
for the
for.
person that lives there.
Yes.
How is that me as a resident? I don't feel better because my neighbor has a Ring bell. That doesn't do.
Oh, I do, because I'll call
That's
him
good.
up
I'm
and
glad
ask
you do.
him what
I don't feel
happened.
better because what is it doing for the residents if they have a surveillance camera on their house?
I'm not talking, we're talking about zoning and commercial. I'm not talking about on someone's house.
You just
We're
said
talking
Ring.
about zoning commercial here. But, so in terms of zoning a commercial building and putting cameras up to a secure facility that, hey, I don't know numbers, but they are known to have break-ins and they're known to have attempts, and I do believe that many people in the community and the communities that have put it in their ordinances felt the need for it just as a layer of security. So if
Talking
something
about
did happen.
deterrence.
Kind of all your opinion, though?
No,
This
I'm
is-
speaking-
so if
look,
you don't
I didn't
give me
write this
specific
myself.
numbers, give me specific numbers. You're talking about.
What do you
but
want
your-
specific
your
numbers on?
opinions. You're talking about these things. You're just talking about your opinion. I think that they put these up because they felt this. This
Well,
is
the
not
city didn't
fact.
write what they felt in the ordinance. It's up
It's
to.
just your opinion. It's
Well, then
no
don't
fact
ask me
you're
my
stating here.
opinion, but you're asking
I
me
never once
why.
asked you your opinion. I
You
never once said,
did.
"Tell
You
me your
asked me
opinion."
why did the ordinance have it in the ordinance? Well, I don't know. I'm assuming.
Then your answer should have been, I don't know.
Well, I can
Not your
assume.
opinion. I didn't
can
ask you your
speak to
opinion.
why I would advocate for that in our ordinance, in reading it in other ordinances, and I can do that. I'm allowed to. So
One factual
I'm allowed to
point,
have
if I
that
may.
opinion.
I mean, one, just so that we can move to the next topic, I think of a simple reality is, one of my attorneys in my office indicates, the simple reality of these things, particularly we're talking about stacking them times 3, we're talking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of product. Odds are, they already have the cameras to protect themselves. So it may be a moot point just on account of the pragmatic.
Well, why would they do that?
Well, that's
Just
what I was
kidding.
mentioning.
Just kidding.
That's what I brought up too.
Thank
I mean,
you.
as a business owner, yeah, I want to protect my property.
But in terms of, what we've got in the ordinance, we've got odor and nuisances in there because they're externalities that we can enforce on, and we can come to an actual, resolution on them if we start putting security requirements in that are above and beyond the security requirements of the state. They're not enforceable. So we don't really have a reason for putting them in there.
Okay, if I can move along a little bit, this is agenda item number 6. It's a public hearing on these 5 amendments. Does that mean I should open this to the public at this point in time? I would think that's
fair.
anyone from the public wish to speak to the issue.
Thank you. Susan again, Susan Phillips. I just had a question. We do have on the books an ordinance number 728 that was signed in 2019 prohibiting any kind of marijuana business. Is this discussion based upon the result of our election in November, or are caregivers facilities already allowed despite this ordinance?
And Joe can probably answer that for you.
There are 4 laws, but really 3 laws that govern the cultivation and sale of marijuana in the state of Michigan. And the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act is one of them. That's the one we've been discussing so far tonight. The other 2, I want to make sure I actually get their names and acronyms correct, because there's lots of words. So the other 2 are the MRTMA, the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act, and then there's the MMFLA.
MMFLA.
Yeah, MMFLA, yeah, that's the one. So the ordinance that Clausen passed prohibiting marijuana uses in the city of Clausen refers specifically to the last one, the most recent one, the one that permitted recreational uses, because there's 3 different ways that cannabis is treated under these 3 different laws. The MMMA, I'm going to be tripping over the alphabet for the rest of the evening. The MMMA permits the primary caregivers, and primary caregivers cannot be prohibited by a community. The Michigan medical, the other medical one, the one that permitted the larger medical uses, a community had to adopt an ordinance permitting those uses in order for those uses to be permitted. So if you didn't take any action, then the uses were just not permitted. And then the third law, the recreational law, allowed those uses unless a municipality adopted an ordinance that prohibited them. So the ordinance we adopted that prohibited them was in response to the third law that permitted the recreational uses, because the city had to adopt a law affirmatively saying we prohibit these uses in order not to permit them. So that's the one that the city passed, and that's what it pertains to. It does not pertain to the use that we're discussing now.
Thank you.
I'm looking at it right now, and it looks like it says medical marijuana transporter, safety compliance facility.
So,
Do you want to look there?
so the question is, there's a list of uses that's prohibited under the prohibition of marijuana establishments. And the list that's in here is, wait, where was it? Okay, there it is. So medical marijuana grower, medical marijuana processor, medical marijuana provisioning center, medical marijuana transporter, medical marijuana safety compliance facility, or any other type of medical marijuana-related business licensed by the state of Michigan under the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act. So it specifically refers to the Michigan Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, which is the second law. And we actually didn't have to adopt anything prohibiting those uses. I guess we did, because simply by not acting on them, they're prohibited. The recreational law, we had to adopt something that prohibited it, and I don't know that this pertains to that. I don't see it referenced in here.
It just says any.
Oh, wait, no, there it is, Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Medical Marijuana Act. So I guess they went ahead and included the Facilities Licensing Act when they adopted this to prohibit the uses permitted under the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act. It wasn't necessary to include them, but they were included. So yeah, this deals with those two laws, and it omits the MMMA as it should, because we can't prohibit the uses that are permitted under the MMMA. So yeah, this pertains to those other two laws, and it does not pertain to the use that we've been talking about so far. It pertains to the one that we're about to talk about.
And even if we did, we'd have to revoke that, right? Because
Correct.
the state is saying that we can't.
It wouldn't be enforceable.
Not,
Yeah.
right.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My second question is, I know that it is located on the map as a dot, the Results Drug Testing Center on Crooks Road, directly across the street from BRD2. Have we considered, as a commission, if we are creating kind of a magnet for people who are already court-ordered to come and get their drug test by Oakland County judges, and then they're right across the street from a potential location for marijuana facilities?
Well, there's no signage. We're talking about Caregiver right now, so it wouldn't be open to a public,
Right.
right?
It's only open to patients specifically registered to that
Thank
caregiver.
you.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
thank you. So that would be for recreational if it goes through.
That'll be the next conversation, right?
Yeah, that'd be the next conversation. Okay, and then I think you've answered the question about the federal law. What about inspection for these caregiver homes for fire safety? Because I understand a lot of these caregiver homes would have like the, like a cylindrical duct work for HVAC, for ventilating because of the high humidity. But then if there's a fire, that does create a trip hazard for the firefighters when they come in.
The specific answer to the question, I'm not sure that I necessarily understand on account of my lack of knowledge with respect to the topic. However, I can tell you with respect to the larger point, we would do an inspection in these facilities the way we do an inspection in any facility when permitting is sought, when changes are made to the system, just like Joe talked about earlier. I don't know if the answer is to your question.
So if this, let's say a medical marijuana caregiver decides to alter conventional residential HVAC and put in ductwork all over the basement to ventilate because of the high level of humidity, at that point, could the city require a fire inspector to come in just because of that risk?
They would, as a matter of course.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Ronis. And the only other thought I had is I was kind of piggybacking on what Aaron was talking about, daycare homes. Daycare homes, of course, are required to maintain a state license. So they do get inspected annually. I really liked your idea about somehow inspecting. I think it's a very valid one.
Thanks. Maybe
Thanks.
one day, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else from the public here wish to comment? Or do we have anybody on Zoom meeting or on YouTube? Any hands raised out there? Nothing out there. Okay, in that case, I will close public hearing on this, or comment. Do we need to make a motion on this to move this along further, or are we just going to because we're going to have another meeting down the line here in November, right?
Joe, can I ask one more question? I don't hate to be that guy. I am. Referencing your sheet again from the MML, it talks about the butane extraction. I don't know much about that, but it sounds like it's probably something that they're trying to prevent combustion type things. I have no idea. Is that something that was in our it says that it is addressed. Is that something that we are enforcing in some way, or is that something that we have built into our?
So butane extraction is recommended to occur only on industrial properties. Butane has a low flash point, which is what makes it a fire hazard. It can combust at a low temperature. So generally speaking, you don't want butane extraction to be occurring in homes, which is part of the reason that you would hope that someone who's engaging in that in a home, which somebody may right now, would potentially look at moving their operation. But yeah, I don't know that we actually have language on it.
So is that something that you said just industrial? So is that something we wouldn't want to put in the other the BRD? Wait, which one? What was it? BRD 2?
Well, I mean, you have a lot of buildings with an industrial character over there. Most of the buildings, really. So, I mean, I'm thinking that if someone's going to be doing it, that's probably something that, you know, we're probably going to allow to happen over there, because it's really homes where we don't want it happening. And by removing the use from homes, then we're curtailing that in the future. Butane extraction is not commonly done by primary caregivers. But there have been cases of it around the state causing fires.
It says edibles. Does that mean like they do that to make like brownies and stuff, or is that just like an oil thing, or do you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, a brownie would be one potential type of
Because
edible, yeah.
we wouldn't, not to go down rabbit hole, if someone's baking, isn't that a whole nother thing? Like in a facility, are we allowing caregivers to actually like bake? Like, are they setting up ovens in their enclosed locked facilities?
Nothing stops them from making a cake or brownies in their house, regardless of what's
Right.
in it.
No, I mean, like I'm picturing in my head like a building that's, you know, got little sheds in it, or, you know, so they can go and put in an oven in there and bake away if they wanted to.
Sure, yeah, if
Okay.
that was part of their operation, yeah.
And they don't need more square footage for that.
You know, probably not, but they practically speaking, they would probably need to add some extra square footage to the 750 that we've got in there as a minimum for the growing area, yeah. But some of those activities are allowed to take place outside of the locked facility too. So under state law, so. Yeah, I mean, if they wanted to do that as part of their operation and were willing to put in the equipment, sure, yeah, they could do it.
Okay.
Okay, after the public hearing on this, on these 5 amendments, moving on to the next chunk here,
So,
I think there's a wrong
Mr.
date
Chair?
on one of these.
Did you close public discussion? Yes.
I don't think we've closed the public hearing yet. That's a point of order, but.
Want to talk about public?
Did-
You just want me to close it?
I got it.
Oh,
I got
okay,
the-
Nick got
the
him,
closure, yeah.
Nick got him closing it. So the thing that, the next step for this is to send it to council. So if you want to, well, you can call for a motion, I guess, if someone would like to make a motion to send it to council and then vote on it. But that's the next step for this ordinance, now that you've had the public hearing.
I'd entertain a motion. On the next chunk of paper here, that when we start getting into the zoning discussion on cannabis, I think there's a wrong date on here, because this says that due to the timeline associated with the potential effective dates, it is suggested that the Planning Commission set a public hearing for November 9th, 2021, which I understand is okay. It says this allows for discussion at the upcoming October 14th meeting, which I believe is incorrect. I think that's tonight's meeting, isn't it?
Thursday,
the
it says the
12th.
12th. Yeah, it's probably just an incorrect date, yeah.
So I take that as just a typo. So
Yes.
we are going to have another public hearing. So at this point in time,
Well, not another public hearing, it'll be a discussion item, yeah. So, yeah, you look for a motion on this public hearing first.
on November 9th, we're scheduled to have a public hearing.
That's for the other cannabis.
Well, if you schedule one tonight, you would have a public hearing then, but
Okay.
we'll get to that.
But that's for the other cannabis,
That's exactly,
not this
that's for the
cannabis.
other one, yeah.
Does anyone want to make a motion for,
Mr. Chair, following the public discussion, which answered many questions posed by this planning commission and members of the general public, I move to submit, as presented in the meeting agenda, an ordinance to amend the City of Clawson zoning ordinance Division 1, Section 34-481, to add definitions for cannabis facilities, and an ordinance to amend the City of Clawson zoning ordinance Division 15 and 27 to add registered primary caregiver facilities as permitted uses to Division 20, to add parking standards for registered primary caregivers, and to Division 21 to add specific standards for registered primary caregivers to our city council for consideration.
Support.
motion, support? Everybody?
Do we have all the sections covered on that?
Would you entertain
I copied it from the,
Yeah, so to the extent that Mr. Sinaki stated as printed on the agenda, that's actually sufficient. So you would cover it just on account of that, and Nick would take care of the remainder.
Okay, I
So-
just wanted
Because I
to
know
know,
some of these get wordy, so.
Yeah.
just wanted to know that we had the 5 sections noted on there too.
Mr. Sinaki did an excellent job with his motion.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
I'll second that.
So I have a motion, I have a second. Anyone
I'd
add,
third it too.
change? You're okay? Roll call, please.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nushai,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
Yes,
Mr. Sinaki,
yes.
Mr. Watson,
Yes.
and Mr. Fitzer.
Yes.
Motion carries, Chair.
Very good, thank you. Agenda item number 7, other business. Here we go with A, zoning amendment discussion, cannabis uses.
With your permission, I'll give you a little bit of background before Joe goes into.
Certainly, he needs a little break, I think.
I think so. Well, Mr. Sinaki, with his long speech about that motion, I think probably covered half of it, so. So now this is the second marijuana topic that we're dealing with. And I know that Joe and Jill gave you a little brief overview. Actually, no, it's not brief. It's a detailed overview of the history that's transpired with respect to this item. You've discussed the issue of recreational cannabis, obviously in the past on a couple of occasions. And as you know, but I'll give you a little bit of history, obviously there's a couple of petitions that are going to be on the ballot come November 2nd. And the petitions were initiatory petitions, which means there were, we had groups, 2 different groups, separate distinct groups in the city that collected signatures for specific language to amend our code of ordinances to allow for recreational marijuana. The 2 petitions are, deal with allowing these various forms of licenses and establishments that you've talked about in the recent past. And the 2 petitions are somewhat different from one another. We're not necessarily going to talk about, and it's not our purview to speak with respect to anything concerning those petitions. The electorate of the city will make its wishes known on account of those 2 petitions come November 2nd. Our role, this body's role, and the city council's role is entirely different, doesn't have anything to do with that. Council had a choice at the time those initiatory petitions were presented to it, and the choice was to either adopt as presented, that's pursuant to our charter, or refer to the electorate. They opted to refer. As such, the electorate will make the determinations. What we're here to talk about and to do is to, obviously, to be proactive and preemptive, so to speak, with respect to zoning considerations again. And this is the appropriate purview of this body. So we we have talked over time with obviously, Joe, Jill, Joan, about presenting to you a draft proposal of an ordinance which you have, which Joe has presented to you, that covers these zoning issues that would arise if one or both of those petitions were to pass come November 2nd. And I think, Joe has done a great job at presenting something that makes sense for the city, that I think it's in sync with the remainder, with the prior item that we just spoke about. And we're looking for your conversation with respect to, again, zoning issues, not the substance of those initiatory petitions, because that's a different issue. So we're here to answer any questions you may have. Joe will go probably into details when it comes time to any of your specific questions with respect to the standards that we've offered here. And obviously, I'm here as well with respect to any questions you may have.
Well, I have a question based on that, so I'll just bring up ballot one time and then I'll drop it.
Okay. I may or may not answer.
And I don't know what's on the ballot initiatives actually, but just for an example, if we discuss and put forth 2 of something and the ballot has 4 of something, how would that?
You're not dealing in that respect. You're not dealing with that issue specifically. That's not the ordinance that you have before you.
Mm-hmm.
The ordinance that you have before you deals with zoning considerations.
Okay.
The petitions that are before the electorate of the city deal with specific numbers of licenses and things of that nature. Those may pass, those may not pass. We have no, our consideration does not deal with that aspect. I didn't tell you this, but I think I should go into it very briefly since because of your question. During this calendar year, our office defended on behalf of the city a couple of lawsuits coming from these petitions. And my point with respect to that is it's a delicate issue for many, many reasons. And there's a lot of interest, rightly so, and thankfully there's a lot of interest from all interested parties in the city. Residents, civic organizations, everyone involved. That makes the job of this body that much harder, unfortunately, because we're talking about that 800-pound gorilla and elephant in the room. But we don't necessarily deal with the specific issues because that's not our prerogative. We're dealing only with zoning considerations. So it's a little tricky, I'm afraid.
It is, because when I've read other ordinances, again, they will talk about the number of ones that they allow, and they will also talk about proximity of, or allowing them to stack, or allowing them to share a building. So those are all things that you don't want to discuss.
We can't. It's not that simply we don't want to. We can because literally, the way that these ordinances, which we're not discussing, came about in the city is by way of initiatory petitions. And it's not an ordinance kind of like the previous one that we just, this body debated or considered just a second ago, where it was presented by us. You crafted basically based through your questioning, the back and forth that occurred with Joe and this body. You came to this finalized version that now you're presented to council. There may be additional amendments that occur there. Here, the initiatory petitions that were presented to the city are final in the way they're presented, and as such, they're going to be it's going to be a yes or no vote on account of the citizens of the city. They will either vote it up or down. This body, nor any other body in the city, has no ability to take action, certainly not before. After the fact, we can offer more, never less, right? There may be other sort of fringe issues that we deal with, but that's not up here today. That's not before this body today.
So do they talk, so we don't talk about, the ballot talks about proximity as well?
Yeah, so the two ordinances, and they're obviously publicly available, so you can read them in their entirety. They do deal with those issues. I mean,
proximity,
one
okay.
more so than the other, but they do.
Okay.
The state law requires uses to be located at least 1,000 feet from schools and churches and such. In the draft of our ordinances, it says would be permitted as a special land use. We're going to allow it in the B1, the B3, the BRD2, the Westgate, and limited industrial districts. We put that into words. Can we still change that? I don't see. I mean, do they have to be allowed in these areas, or can we arbitrarily say that we don't want some of them in certain areas?
Well,
Say my preference would that I wouldn't want one at the Westgate area. Could we, as a board, keep them out of there?
that is why you're discussing it. So yes, I mean, there is a list of districts in here, and it does not necessarily reflect the list of districts that we'll walk out of here with. That is for discussion among the planning commissioners. I think they were put out there because they're the viable districts physically for those uses. But you may determine as a commission that even though they may be viable physically for those uses, they are not viable from another perspective. You may find that simply because of their location or something like that, they're not good locations for those uses. Keep in mind, of course, that if these uses are to be permitted here, we do have to realistically permit them to operate in the city. The districts are up to discussion.
We can't zone them out
Right.
of existence.
Right, you can just limit what,
I'm sorry?
you can just limit the zones that they're in, but you can't zone them out.
You have
Right.
to have some rationality behind it, I imagine, is, the standard.
But we still zone from our master plan, correct?
Absolutely.
So when we look at these districts and read our master plan and find that they don't fit within that, that
Excellent point.
is,
Exactly right.
okay.
The master plan, if you're going to eliminate one of these districts, as say you don't want it in B1 or something, the master plan is what you want to lean on.
Well, I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
trying to lean on it,
Yeah.
but when
Well,
I
no,
read
that's what it's
those,
for. That's
but when I
literally
read
what it's
those, I'm
for.
like, how does that fit in our master plan? Westgate doesn't fit in, BRD2 doesn't fit. Like, I feel like, and
Keeping in mind that the master plan does not specifically deal with cannabis uses, some of the uses that are mentioned in here have an industrial character and others have a commercial character. So you do have to consider the districts that you're going to permit them in light of that. So again, we're not zoning them out, but we can discuss which districts it's appropriate to permit them in.
Jim's trying to speak. Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, sorry,
Just
Jim.
by the same token, just looking at the map now, do we have every item or school district or child care center? Is this the latest and greatest? Because I see a couple missing.
Okay. well, let's
May
see.
2021. Working draft.
I'm going to orient that page correctly so I can see it better. Well, I know we have all of the public schools and.
Right, you got that, but there's child care, I know, that's on Crooks, north of 14, or south of 14.
but when you say, when we're zoning, you're talking property line to property line, like, right? We don't have to eliminate it out of the whole zone, right? If there is that establishment, if there is a childcare facility there, they can go
Oh, that's
1,000 square
correct.
feet away,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. If
Yeah.
half of the BRD4 district, which is not a district in the city of Clawson, I just made it up so that I didn't have to refer to a real district. If half the BRD4 district is within 1,000 feet of a school, but the other half isn't, you can still allow it in the BRD4 district, and it's just permitted only in the half that's not within 1,000 feet of a school. Yeah, exactly. You're correct about
Right,
that.
all I was looking at was an overview to just, when you looked at the map, you knew right away where you could go, where you couldn't go.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure because Would that include any of the residents' homes that have childcare licenses?
I don't think it does because we don't necessarily have a great record of where all those are. And, you know, also you're dealing with a situation where.
You'd be legislating it out of existence.
Exactly,
basically.
yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, it is what it is. When it says 1,000 feet from such establishments,
It's actually, you know, it's about as astute a point as it gets, so I'm gonna give you a 10 out of 10 on that one. And
Thanks.
I'll do some, not that you needed that confirmation, and I'll do some looking into. I don't know that it would necessarily jive, though, to be perfectly honest with you.
like I said, this way, it's an instant, you know, where's where, and,
That's the very idea behind the map that
Right.
I've drawn out, so you're
yeah,
right.
and I concur with that. Just wanted to make sure it's totally inclusive.
Yeah, so we run into the issue in Clausen where nothing is 1,000 feet from anything. So we have to be kind of careful where we set our buffers because we will be excluding things if we set too many of them. So
But the
yeah,
thou-
we're
The 1,000 feet is 1,000 feet,
yeah. So we do have
and
to be
that's the
careful about
parameter,
that.
so.
It is.
But yeah, like a home daycare wouldn't be included on this map. No,
I just
'cause we
wanted
don't
to,
have a way of knowing where it is.
Bring that up.
I bet you if we look at, you know, there's probably a definition that gets us exactly at the answer to your question. So that's what we will do. We'll find that very definition. And then we'll update the map, because I agree with you. It is what it is. As the crow flies, 1,000 feet, right? Whatever that may
If
be.
they want to cite the law, hey, there it is.
Sure.
Okay, so
Thank you.
with our prior
I think Mr.
oh, sorry, I
Mr.
didn't see your
Sinaki
hand up.
was-
Sorry.
I didn't get there in
You're not
time.
as loud as me. Go ahead.
Not yet. The intent is to be prepared for the possibility of two voter-initiated amendments to our
It is.
city ordinance. Okay.
Yes.
So, given that we spent a whole lot of time, what I saw when I read through this the first time, and now more understanding what some of the ordinances say, we don't talk about, I think, 4 of the 6 types.
No,
Is that intentional?
it's not our prerogative. It's not our right. It's not this body's, that's not what's before you.
Well, but wouldn't it be, for instance, appropriate to categorize a retailer and say that we understand what that business is, and then there are areas of the city designated by zoning that are great for retailer, as opposed to a transporter, and there might be areas of the city that are more relative to shipping and receiving? Not, say, for instance, you wouldn't have that in a retail district because you don't have the ability for the big trucks or whatever. So we have those different types of things. Would it be better for us to concentrate on saying, these are how the city of Clausen understands that these particular types of marijuana businesses potentially proposed fit into our master plan, and enumerate each one of them? For instance, if I were to have a large grow facility, I might look at the ordinance and say that only applies in the industrial district because it's an industry, it's large, and we only have one type of small industrial district. So if you could fit one in there, this is the area of Clausen that you could fit. And like the other scenario, I think that I understand is a test facility. well, that might be like some of the small businesses and labs, and there are areas in the city that might be appropriate for that. Should we be doing that and maybe a bunch of these definitions as a baseline?
I think Joe,
Other-
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Otherwise, I look at this as being a marathon that we would take several meetings before we as a planning commission are ready to recommend something that's kind of finessed for public review.
I think Joe agrees with you. And the reason I say that is that, I mean, as I understand the ordinance, that he's presented to you, he's done exactly that, in my understanding of it, right? Which is why you have, for example, like, on page 2, Part 3, amend Division 14B3, so on and so forth, to permit specific cannabis facilities as follows: cannabis retailer, cannabis safety compliance facility, right? I think that's what that addresses to a great extent. Now, you can amend those. I think the specifics then of your question, I think, go into, we have to bring those to the kind of facilities that make sense for that district, as this body understands, again, the master plan and how that particular specific use fits within that specific district. So I think I agree with you. I think Joe agrees with you. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I do actually agree.
Yeah.
But I think the other 4 are missed. And how do we address the other 4 that are missed? Because I was getting into this, and if I look at, and they explained to me and I understood better what B1 local districts, I might say that the retailers are appropriate, but maybe, for instance, the testing facility is not really in that business district, it more goes to what we did like in the office or whatever other type of a district. And I don't know those things, but what I missed is the other 4 or 5 that are enumerated in the ordinance.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it was drafted that way, honestly.
It's
I
all-
tried, Joe drafted it.
So, and that's the very purpose for us being here and doing this, right? To have exactly that feedback from this body, so that then we can update that ordinance with those specific things in mind. And it doesn't matter, as far as the marathon point, it may well be, it is usually, this is how you draft laws, right? Is that the good old adage, if you enjoy sausage and respect the laws, you shouldn't see either one being made. This is how you make, this is how we make laws, okay? It's not pretty, it's just this back and forth between a body such as this one and professionals such as us, and we create it at the end. So, absolutely, we just need to have that conversation started, and this is the place to do it. And that's the very conversation that begins it, as far as I'm concerned. So we're taking good notes. So I'll take any and all recommendations, any and all thoughts from each and every single one of you to update this ordinance and bring it to such fashion before you where you would vote, motion it up, vote it, and take care of it.
Now, in the time frame, can that realistically be done before November 9th public hearing?
That's not, so we don't have to schedule it at that particular date, of course. We are not committed to that particular date. We would want to. We would want to. So we'll take your feedback. Now's the time, right? We'll take, whatever that may be. And then we'll update it, and we'll bring it back to you. You'll have it ahead of time, of course. That's our wish. If in your reasoned opinion, that's too soon, you need more, you require the time that you require. I mean, we're not going to push that. We hope that we can get there, though.
So we're not putting us in any type of jeopardy if it goes a little bit past that?
Well, and
Time-wise,
that's, yeah, I mean, jeopardy is not the term that I would use.
I don't
but-
use the right language apparently
It's okay.
ever, so take it with a grain of salt, everybody.
No worries. Jeopardy is not the term I use, but, I mean, we would want to be ready for what's coming, for what we may consider coming, but we don't know the end result of this election. Nobody can predict that. One may pass, 2 may pass. Depending on which one may pass, we may have different considerations to be made, or none at all. But if none at all, for example, this is an issue that we nonetheless need to be working on, because it's not going to be a dead issue even if it's voted down. it will be back. We'll be back again. I think we have to be proactive. We have to have something, and that's why we're here. And we tried our best to try to time it. Timing is critical here. We don't have, we try to have the two coincide, right? This ordinance and that public hearing along with the election, because that's the way we must do it, unfortunately.
Yeah, the timing seems off to me because we're going to vote on the 2nd, November 2nd, and applications are open in mid-November and close in mid-December, and then we're going to have a public hearing on November 9th. So it seems to me like they're going to be putting their applications in, and we don't have anything down on paper yet.
Yeah. And that's, so here's the trick. Part of the trick that we're all engaged in, and the reason why we have to have these caveats in our conversation, and we have to time it the way that we have to time it, is the simple reality that we must not appear to place our hand on the scale come November 2nd, one way or another. Okay, that becomes very tricky. And the reason I mentioned those, a couple of losses that I was engaged in is to point out, among others, that there's enough of a focus on this to where that may be an issue. That consideration is critical. So we couldn't necessarily do something that would be ready prior to the vote. We have to think in terms of after the vote.
Okay, on home health caregivers, we don't have that much control because the state of Michigan obviously has the control on that. This we seem to have a little bit more control over. If somebody's going to come in here and open up a dispensary, are they going to have to jump through us, through the Planning Commission, for their site plan approval?
Yeah.
So we can keep a closer eye on them as what's going on and what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, just about every one of these would require site plan approval in some respect. The micro businesses might be the one exception, depending on how that's operated. Yeah, you're going to see a dispensary, you're going to see, I mean, that's kind of an inexact term. I guess it's not the term in the law. But you'll see all the other ones for site plan approval.
And we're gonna keep going here. I noticed there wasn't any alphabet letters after it. That's also intentional, right? ABC, because it was just kind of a blatant one.
You talking about the definitions?
Yeah, as in terms of grower, there's usually, you've given us information in the past that has like class, I think it's like class, is it called class A, class B, class C? Those things aren't things we need to focus on specifying at this point in time, is that right?
Right, and well, in terms of the growers, the classes refer more to the growers as they're regulated under the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act. The Recreational Act kind of did away with a lot of that. And we're really looking at the MRTMA here because that's what is being, the law, the initiation ballot petitions are dealing with the MRTMA. So that's what those are the uses that we're dealing with here.
So I thought I had a handle on this, man.
I know.
Okay, so the MRTMA, are we covering the MMFLA though? Are we or is that another thing that can come at us? Because we've got 2 out of 3 that we got going here, right? Or
yeah, the MMFLA is, I don't want to say it's a completely obsolete law at this point because everybody just sort of jumped as soon as the recreational uses became available. It was easier to just go for that, and you can sell stuff that's medical grade from your recreational operation as long as it's tested. So the medical law is now getting kind of leapfrogged by the MRTMA, which allows you to do a lot more, and all the operators that we're either getting in or already in are pretty much switching over to complying with the MRTMA and not really worrying about the Medical Facilities Licensing Act. And the initiatives that shall not be spoken of in detail are dealing with the MRTMA uses. So that's what we're trying to deal with here. And we do reference the MMFLA in a couple of these definitions here. But they're really focusing on those uses that are in the MRTMA, if you read the language.
So are we gonna go by line, or how, what do you think is our best way of approaching this? Kind of line by line, or should we find where we found little open places where we might have suggestions or questions, or?
I would imagine you're looking at starting part 2, part 3, part 4 per Mr. Sanaki's point, which I thought was excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, I think,
Because otherwise, like, the definitions, I don't imagine you will have that much trouble with, right?
well, they're all rooted in state law,
Right,
so.
but I didn't know if we wanted to talk about the overall, again, I don't know, is this allowed here? The overall ability for municipality to actually, I won't even say license, I won't say that, but I'll say regulate in a different capacity than caregiving. In terms of, and again, I hate to keep referencing that other ordinances, but really that's all I can look at, is because I don't know what I don't know. So when looking at other ordinances, a lot of them put forth statutes in terms of how they might apply for certain licenses, and how they might renew those licenses, and how they might regulate and enforce certain aspects that we're not allowed to enforce in caregiving, but it sounds like maybe we're allowed to in our DMA. Do we want to go down that hole, or do we want to just start right where Ed took us
We're gonna
first?
start right where it took us.
Ed took us?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's start with
Okay.
where Ed took us, and because you're right, it is a hole, and we got to go there. But yeah, I mean, I guess I'll briefly say that the zoning component is one component, and a licensing ordinance is the other component, and that the licensing ordinance kind of does a lot of what you're talking about. So, and that's the portion that we have less control over. Because that's what's on the ballot, not the zoning is something that we do kind of
The
separately or in
licensing
parallel.
component is on the actual ballot.
Exactly, right.
And I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, I don't know. Does the ballot talk about how we might go forward with applications and regulations? Is that what you're saying?
There, well,
Yeah.
I don't want to say too much.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just really going off of the only thing I've read and compared to.
I completely
It's
understand.
completely,
You wanna know, and
yeah.
it's totally understandable.
It's completely understandable. The short answer, unfulfilling as it will be, is yes. And we're gonna stick with that one.
Wait, what was the question?
The one that you just asked, whether it goes into licensing or not.
Yes, okay, so,
Yes.
okay, all right, so we'll address that future.
There is a sample ballot in the lobby.
Yeah, actually, yeah, they're both out there. So, right, districts. So, there are 5 districts listed here. B1, B3, limited industrial, Westgate, and BRD2. And as Commissioner Sanaki noted, there are 6 uses. 2 of them are listed here as sort of like a placeholder for discussion. And I got 6 uses, which are in the memo.
As you're talking about that, I did pull up marijuana proposal number 2, and it lists 8 different types of operations. And I think later on in the information you sent to us, it kind of expands on what those operations are. Have you gotten far enough to say if it was allowed in the city, that we characterize this similar to, and therefore is possible to be consistent with the other characteristics of B1, B2, and I1 or
Right.
something.
Yeah, great
And-
question.
And getting into that, the other scenario, is there some things that we as a city of Clawson can say, I don't know, a Class D grower does not have enough space in our I-1 district, if they took over the entire district, to be classified as a Class D grower. It's not in the list. I did what you did. So, you know, can we just state by that we can determine that we should not allow a Class D grower in the city of Clawson because we have no known zone district that is capable of handling that particular facility?
Go ahead.
So, and I think that, at least for me, in the way my mind is working right now, if I had that type of a background and we agreed on that, then we can start finessing where we believe that the sections of the ordinance ought to be expanded to state specifically that that is an approved use. Because that's what we characteristically do. If it's not an approved use, then it's probably not right for that particular zone district.
I think yours is an exceptionally well thought out point. It's going to run, I think, by definition, there's going to be there's a potential clash of our ordinances that you're describing that may occur. You can have one or both of the initiatory petitions pass on account of the vote, by the votes of the electorate of the city. And if one of those potential ordinances allows for a specific kind of license, one that, when, in your reasoned opinion, doesn't fit within our zoning, right? Therefore, you de facto legislate it out of existence because you say it doesn't appropriately fit in any district, right? Any use for X, Y, and Z pursuant to our master plan, for all the reasons possible. Then, yeah, you would have a clash, right? You would have an ordinance passed by the voters of the city that says this use is permitted in the city, and there's some touching upon zoning as well in at least one of the petitions. But be that as it may, you would have that, and then you would have an ordinance by this body, or a potential ordinance that legislates out. Yeah, there's a clash there, and those kind of conflicts that may come about, if they're throughout the process of getting there, we would obviously amend. If we're somehow done before anything else happens, we have to amend. We have to come back to you, start the amendment process one way or another, because you can't have that conflict. So I think that's ultimately the answer to your question. But I think for purposes of moving forward, I will move forward, and I think I'll leave Joe to his thoughts, but I think we will move forward with your best opinions with respect to how this ordinance should be. I'll take whatever you present, whatever you believe is appropriate, we'll take that and we'll move that forward. I think it's important that we do so, regardless of what may occur or what may transpire. And this is the trick portion of it, because we're doing it with that knowledge, right?
Right, and I guess with respect to the growers, I think that at this point, because we're trying to be ready to deal with whatever might be sent our way, it might be best to list growers without making a distinction with regard to class of grower, and determine what district might be appropriate for an appropriately sized grower. And if it turns out that we are looking for places to put growers, then we have it in place, and we sort of have to rely on the physical carrying capacity of the community to determine who's going to apply to be a grower. And if we're not looking at a situation where we have to permit growers, then we simply remove it from the ordinance before it goes to council. So that's, I mean, I guess that's where I would land on that. And as far as a community like Clawson is concerned, we have no agricultural land. So industrial structures are really what you're looking at as the only potential buildings that could, or areas of the city that could potentially house a grower. And I guess I'll go through the 8 uses and I'll give my opinion on the character of the use as it relates to the districts that we have in our zoning ordinance. And you all can respond to that. We have a designated consumption establishment, which, when we look in our ordinance, is, I would say, definitely most similar to the smoking establishments that we recently regulated in our ordinance, which are permitted in the B3 district only. As a secondary use, you may be able to make a case that they are similar to a tavern or something like that, but I think the smoking establishment is kind of the obvious one. Grower, as I just said, is something that's going to occur indoors in a community like Clawson and is essentially an industrial use. When we look at the micro business, so for the benefit of anybody who might be behind me listening and who doesn't have the memo in front of them, I think grower is kind of obvious what that is, but micro business is specifically defined in the statute and not very obvious. So it means a person or entity licensed to cultivate not more than 150 marijuana plants, process and package marijuana, and sell or otherwise transfer marijuana to individuals who are 21 years of age or older, or to a marijuana safety compliance facility, but not to other marijuana establishments. Micro business is potentially the evolution of the primary caregiver. If primary caregivers are, further restricted in the future, I can see a lot of those people moving to the micro business realm because it allows them to do something very similar to what they're doing now. It's just considered a commercial business now rather than a smaller operation.
From a micro business, they can distribute from that. Is that correct?
Yes, they can sell or otherwise transfer marijuana to individuals. So yes, they are
Individuals, but not
distributors.
But not to other growers.
not to like
Right.
a store.
So they can't sell to a provisioning center,
Right.
but they can sell directly to individuals, yeah. So that kind of falls between an industrial and a commercial use. It's probably more on the industrial side because of the scale of the growing portion of it. That's where I would land on it anyway. As far as a processor, that's clearly an industrial use to me. They are taking in product, they are processing it, and they are turning it into a product that is going to be for sale via a provisioning center, or they can send it to another processor. I believe they're able to send it out to testing labs and receive it back from the testing lab too. That's an industry, right? That's an industrial use. Processing in general is generally considered an industrial use under our zoning ordinance. Provisioning center, so this is the commercial business that is in the business of receiving cannabis products from growers and processors, and then they are selling it to customers. That clearly has a retail dimension as its primary feature. So that's a commercial business. Safety compliance facility, they're the ones who are testing things. We have a research use that's permitted in the BRD2 district, for instance. We have industrial uses that include research uses permitted over in the light industrial district. So when we look at the safety compliance facility, I think it clearly fits in those two districts. Secure transporter, that's a commercial entity that stores marijuana and transports it between facilities for a fee. So if a grower sends their product to a processor, a secure transporter is the entity that takes it from one place to the other. And that is, again, I would say pretty clearly a use within an industrial character, because you have a small storage component. In some cases, the secure transporter will be temporarily holding that product before it's delivered to its final destination.
How in some cases? Wouldn't it be in every case?
Well, okay, if you consider being in transit to be holding, then yes, absolutely in every case. But they may hold it on their premises.
Got it. So not with a vehicle.
Exactly.
Sitting there.
They may not, and may not hold it every time. They may transport directly in some cases, but in some cases they may have cause to hold it on their premises.
Makes
So
sense.
to me, you've got a vehicle or maybe even a fleet of vehicles that you're probably going to be keeping on a site. And then you've got that potential kind of warehousing element. That to me is also clearly an industrial use. And then we have the temporary marijuana event license, which is a little different because that's not a land use necessarily. It's not like a business that opens up in a location and is always in that location. You can hold a marijuana event. You're a marijuana event organizer. It's a weird license because you could do it you could be an organizer from a very small office. Like you don't necessarily even have to have a commercial property to do that because you're not really handling the product until your event. And then at the event, the product is changing hands. So in terms of the organizer themselves, they can hold a temporary marijuana event license.
Joe, does that mean the events are happening here specifically? Or in how many?
Potentially, they could organize an event that occurs in Clawson, yes. And that they would be subject to our temporary event regulations, which we do have some in our code of ordinances. But, someone who's an organizer and holds the license could potentially live in Clawson and hold their event somewhere else too.
So does that open us up to a certain, and maybe I'm not supposed to ask this, I don't remember this when we've talked about it prior, to a certain number of events held within the city? Or is that just literally
No.
that entity that's holding
It's
it?
literally the entity who holds the license to organize these events.
Huh, okay.
It's the weirdest of all the licenses.
Okay.
It's definitely the strangest one because it's not a land use in the same sense as all the other uses where you have a clear location that they operate from and it's a fixed location. This person could be the license holder and may actually not really have much of a physical location that they're operating from, but they're choosing locations to hold these events.
The event itself is a different
The event
scenario.
itself is a different
Okay,
thing, yeah.
okay.
So it's a.
They could hold it in their backyard then, eh?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I would have to look and see what the state law says about.
Like Jim's backyard we're
About it.
talking about. No, just Jim's.
No, mine's not big enough, but I'm sure there are some good-sized backyards.
Yep.
And it would depend on what they're going to do at the event too, because sometimes you
Right.
have certain things for state licenses and Like on the bingo or anything like that, you could have marijuana bingo, you know?
Yeah, there is a body of state law that governs how their events take place and what can happen there, but I don't know the details of it, to be perfectly honest. It's the weird one. It's the
Put that on the back burner.
yeah. I don't know that it's necessarily one we'll be dealing with, but
Yeah, like how do we even zone for that, right? Like if
I
it's
don't
someone's
think you
living
really-
in Clawson,
I don't think you
we
really
can't
do.
zone them to live in a commercial building.
That one doesn't really get assigned to a district, I don't
Okay,
think.
it's just kind of there. hanging out.
Because you could have, just like graduation parties in your backyard.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but it's not even allowing them to actually hold an event.
No, it's not permitting the event. It's
just permitting
them
the
to be
license
the organizer.
to-
Yeah. So
Like
we
the
don't-
entity, like a corporation maybe owns an event building? Is that what, maybe? No? I don't know, like the balloon
really.
house things?
No, I mean, it means a state license held by a marijuana event organizer under the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act for an event where the on-site sale or consumption of marijuana products or both are authorized at the location indicated on the state license. So it's, I mean, unless somebody, I mean,
So if their home address is on the state license,
Well, yeah, did you
Right.
just say they are allowed to hold it at the
I guess it is. I guess
address
there is
that's
a
at the
location
license?
on the license. Yeah.
So they can just have events, that's a place to host
Yeah.
events, it sounds.
back to the backyard.
I guess I'll break the taboo on talking about the ballot initiatives just long enough to say that one's not listed in either one of them, so we don't really need to deal with it. And I think it's probably best if we just don't.
Yeah. Food for thought.
Right. So we can leave that one off the list, but the other ones, they're all, very clearly physical locations. And, I guess I've given you my thoughts on them, and I guess I'd like to know if you're generally in agreement with my opinion on what they're similar to, or if you would have some different opinions on that.
Mr. Chair, I think the discussions that we're having will affect the voters on the petitions. We cannot escape this, the questions that arise from the petitions, like the commissioners that have had the questions so far. So I think it's best practice to delay this after the petitions are voted by the public, because if we are affecting them in any shape or form, it's not fair to the people that already voted on these petitions, because there are absentee ballots out that people already voted on. That's my thought. So if you're ready, I would like to make a motion to table this after the elections of November 2nd. Please.
To table any changes till after the election?
I think
We can-
the motion was to table discussion
The
until.
discussion for all the
Discussions
zoning.
After the election.
Yep.
There's a motion. Anyone want to support that, or?
Support.
Okay. You have a support, so you can have discussion on the motion. Is there any comment from the attorney on the motion?
Obviously, it's entirely the purview of this body. My two cents is you proceed forward, you nonetheless do the work. It is tricky. I mean, it goes without saying. It is tricky. It's a tricky conversation, and actually the point about the absentee ballots is well made. I mean, I take that into account. Nonetheless, it's work that will need to be done. As to when you do it, it's obviously entirely your purview.
I have a motion, I have support. Anyone want to add anything, subtract anything? Are we all happy with it?
No, I think it's important we have these discussions.
I think we should still go forward.
So I'm gonna vote against that one, but that's about all I got.
Well, if you don't want to change the motion, I'll do roll call on the motion, and we'll see how the vote turns out.
Yes.
How's that work?
Fine with that?
Yep.
Okay, roll call, please.
Mr. Sinaki,
No.
Mr. Watson,
Yes.
Mr. Fitzer,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
No.
Mr. Nushai,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond.
No,
Carry 4-3.
Correct. Motion carries. Sorry, I was counting votes.
Who seconded that? Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we take the essence of our discussion and direct the planner to prepare more definite information based upon our discussion today, knowing that it was just discussion, but we had a lot of good stuff that we characterized today, and it would be great if we could have that motion, or have the planner prepare that back to us in preparation for the meeting where we do untable and bring it back for discussion.
Support.
Most likely there'll be a vote too, but of necessity, I think the planner will do exactly that, I think, by the time we come back. So regardless of, I mean, if that be the wish of this body, of course, but at any rate, we'll take all this, we'll put it together, we'll update the ordinance that was presented to you, okay?
And you want to put a date on that at all?
I think sorry, I didn't mean to jump into your conversation, but I think based on the prior motion, the date is sort of already set as to after the election.
After the election.
November 9th would probably be the earliest date.
I guess I would amend it to say at the time that the planner is ready to present that back to us and put it on our agenda. If it's the 9th and that's reasonable, that's okay. If we decide to move it to a different date, that would be okay by me too.
Okay, who's second that?
I'll support that, too.
Did you second it the first time?
Yep.
Okay, you're going to approve that. Okay, any other comments? Roll call, please.
Mr. Watson,
Yes?
Mr. Fitzer,
Yes.
Mr. Cusero,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nushai,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
Yep.
Mr. Sanaki.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good. Excuse me, agenda item number 7B is remote meeting attendance discussion.
Yes, Mr. Sanaki requested that this be on the agenda, and I thought it was a good idea to put it on there and discuss it. So we, for each meeting, there is a remote attendance option, and we're providing a phone-in option for the public, and obviously people can watch it on YouTube as well. And there's also a video attendance option, which a couple of planning commissioners have availed themselves of when they've been unable to attend in person. And the last time we had a couple of commissioners attend in person, I was informed by the clerk that they could not vote. They could participate in discussion, but they were not allowed to vote remotely. And you can chime in if you have any input on this, but essentially the understanding that I got from the clerk is that because we don't have an active local state of emergency, the remote full participation option is no longer available. And in order for that to become available again, we would have to have an active local state of emergency. This city of Detroit has one that expires on December 31st, and they're still doing their meetings remotely, and remote attendance includes voting. But I guess it's a quirk of the way the law works that we can allow people to participate remotely, but we can't actually allow them to vote on motions remotely. And like I said, if you've got anything to add to that,
Yeah, I can chime in a little, I suppose. We actually have, it's unfortunate because in my estimation, it was unfortunate that this is the reality. Because I thought, capability of participating via Zoom at least having the option is great. Is great for participation, is great no matter how you slice it. And whomever wants to appear in person, obviously, that hybrid meeting would account for both. But we do, Clausen did pass an emergency declaration initially when Corona first struck, basically when this. That's never been rescinded. However, we've had a series of laws that, that have been passed and certain authority that was taken away from the governor of the state of Michigan, which really sort of did away with some of our, ability to participate, to do the hybrid meetings. And there's been no additional action in council to either update, that state of emergency necessarily to be able to allow us at least the argument that is a baseline necessity to be able to craft, something that says that we can participate still via Zoom. I'm not sure, based on my current understanding of current law in place in the state of Michigan, would permit that. I don't know how. I'm familiar with Detroit and how they're doing it. I myself have some doubts about the actions that they're taking and the votes that they're taking. And I think at the very least, at one point or another, they're going to have to go back and actually either vote or basically, give all their prior actions some new meaning when they meet in person. But be that as it may, those are their choices. As far as this community is concerned, unfortunately, we're in a situation where I don't think we can necessarily legally do so, allow for this, because we have no direction from the state that gives us that authority necessarily. So it's unfortunate. I thought it worked much better, obviously, before with the ability to do a hybrid, but until and unless something changes, and there's bills, there's action in this regard, and hopefully we'll get there. But until we do get there, this is the reality. I think August, our clerk, is correct in his assessment that you can participate remotely, but cannot vote. I think that's an accurate statement.
And I guess I will wrap up that explanation just by saying that I agree completely with Commissioner Sanaki that we're moving into the future, and remote participation, full remote participation as a voting member should, in the long term, become something that is normalized. I think it should be legal to permit to participate from the screen and be a full voting member. I don't see why in the 21st century we can't do that. But the law hasn't gotten there yet. Even if the technology is there at this point, the law has just not gotten there yet. So if there are any other questions on that,
Not yet.
we're happy to
Does
answer
that answer
them.
your question?
Well, I guess in my case, when we talked about hybrid meetings, because we did say in the beginning when we came back that there were some situations that hybrid was appropriate. When we didn't have it, it would have been better if I would have known.
Right, yeah, and I understand that.
I would have known
and-
because I might have been able to rearrange my work schedule so that I could have been here at the time, but my schedule said that I couldn't. And because I was under the understanding, and I guess didn't know all the other law that was in there, that my participation was both. If they would have said, no, you don't have this special option, because it was a special option, you had to call in and get the right thing. So I guess I just missed that discussion, and I was really surprised when we had the first roll call that it said, well, no, you can't vote.
And I have to admit that I was surprised as well. I
That's
would
okay.
have I would have told you if I had known. But when the clerk chimed in with that, it was new, and I wasn't aware yet. So I do apologize that happened. But yeah,
I guess so do I.
the changing landscape of law.
I guess so do I. I didn't realize that this happened during a meeting that you found out. It shouldn't be the way that you find out, obviously. The state of Michigan had been passing Well, at first, it was a matter of the governor passing her executive, throwing her executive orders, one after the other, suspending the OMA or those portions of the OMA, or the Open Meetings Act, to be able to allow us to participate remotely. And then, obviously, the litigation occurred, focusing on the governor's authority to be able to have such emergency orders. Once that, and there was a series of, laws that was passed by our legislature to allow for the continuation of remote participation, and then all of a sudden, those timelines all expired.
Got it.
And so, but I didn't realize that that's what transpired, and I guess there's a failure in communication there that shouldn't happen, because that's no way to find out, obviously, and for all the reasons that you stated. So, on behalf of the clerk and everybody else and myself, we apologize.
I understand. It was just, that's good. Thank you.
I have two comments on that. First of all, everyone has to have the same equipment available to get into it, because I know I had trouble getting in. So if everything's got to be on an even plateau in order for, just like we have the screen right up there, I mean, if you got the virtual screen and everything and everybody's tuned in and you can see everybody, that's great. That's one item. Next item, meeting like this, we have more in-depth discussion and comments and more history coming in, plus the feedback that you get from our comments. I mean, it's right there. That remote thing, I mean, yeah, can you hear me? No, okay, wait a minute, let me hit some buttons. And that was the other drawback on that. We have better discussions when we're sitting right here, my opinion.
Well, I thought your voice chimed in just fine when I heard a couple of those meetings.
Yeah.
But that's just one man's opinion, of course.
Right, and I think that remote participation is certainly not for everyone, and that's why, going forward, hybrid structures for these meetings are really the answer, I think, is that some people are going to be comfortable and capable, just in terms of their infrastructure that they've got available to them, of remote participation, and other people are going to prefer not to. And, there are parts of the country where there's no broadband. So remote participation is not really a great option for anyone. And some of those parts of the country are half an hour from here, just on the fringe of urban Detroit. But, for people who do have the capability and may have schedules that make in-person attendance difficult, I do think that in the future, I'd like to see the state provide the ability to
It would
run
it'd
hybrid
be a
meetings.
nice option. And I
It
get your
would.
point, Jim. I agree wholeheartedly that we do have much better discussions when we're all in person. But it would be a nice option.
Right.
How about if we have electronic voting?
So there's actually.
You're gonna want to go to mail-in next,
No, I skipped that part. I'm getting with this modern technology stuff,
Racing pigeons, yeah. There's actually some case law from sometimes the 70s or 80s that talks about, some form of, electronic participation and electronic participation in these kinds of meetings. Board meetings, I think the specific case dealt with like a school board meeting. So there's been some, and it talks about, I won't remember all the details, but among others, there's conversation, there's, argument in the case, and the ultimate ruling of the case was where you could participate if, but, wherever you were, there had to be some, obviously some sort of ability, kind of like we have today, even way back then, where you have video participation, where the public can see you, the public would have to know ahead of time where you were, so they could, if they chose to, attend with you at your location, wherever it may be, like Boca Raton, whatever. So the trend has been there for a long time. The desire has been there for a long time. It's a great option, not for everybody, obviously, but it's a great option to have for those kinds of situations where you may not be able to make it, but you can still participate. Where so I think we're getting there, we're getting close. There's a few bills, I mean, last I checked, there's a few bills making their way through the legislature that were introduced, to deal with this specific issue. As to where it'll fall, who knows? We're obviously encumbered as a city. This is another one of those issues that we can't affect it because we're creatures of the Open Meetings Act. So de facto, it's either the state will allow us to do it or they won't. And so that's why when I look at Detroit, it's shocking to me. So hopefully, but that's for the future.
When you hit your buzzer, you have to be careful that you don't accidentally buy a vowel. So anyway, that's that issue.
Okay, are we prepared to move on to agenda item number 8, the planner's report?
I'll just report that in your packet, I included our most recent newsletter. The topic is sustainability and resiliency. There's a little blurb about National Planning Month, which is October, at the end of it as well.
Okay, do we have anything under staff report and training opportunities?
Staff report was included in your packet. Joan was not able to be here and speak tonight due to an injury, so she asks that if you have any questions about the staff report that you email them.
Okay. And a legal update.
Nothing additional. Thank you very much for having me tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
And if there's any other comments, now's the time to make them. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
If anybody didn't get one, I do have them available. The Clausen Athletic Booster Football Fantasy, the Football Frenzy for this year is in business, and it's not too late. They make great gifts, weddings, anniversaries, friends, whenever. So I do have them if you wish to participate. No increase in price either. Thanks, Greg.
You want to adjourn now?
Yes, I'll make a motion that we adjourn the meeting of this evening.
I'll second it.
I have a motion, I have support. Roll call, please.
Mr. Cusero,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nushai,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
Yes.
Mr. Sanaki,
Yes.
Mr. Watson,
Yes.
and Mr. Fitzer.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you, everyone.
Y'all have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.